Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Oh my gosh, this city is freaking awesome. Let me talk to you a little bit about Cape Town, a little bit about South Africa, and a little bit about Africa as a whole with a little geology spun into it. All that in 5 minutes or less. Right, like that's ever gonna happen. First off, let's take a quick tour of the city because this place is magnificent. For anyone who's ever even thought about going to Africa, you must come to Cape Town. And honestly, you should come here first before you go anywhere else because it's not really like Africa at all. This is a full-on European style city in terms of levels of development, its richness, its quality of life. It's actually a big tourist mecca. You would be quite home here in Africa because if you got dropped here blindfolded, you'd swear you were in Europe anyway. And I'm going to come back to that point of why that is and why geology plays a bit of a part of that and what that has to do with the bigger picture of South Africa as a whole right now. But a quick city tour. Here we are on Lion's Head Mountain. We hiked up this, sweated off several pounds to get to the top of this on a beautiful sunny day, which is pretty much every day in South Africa, especially here on the coast because it's Mediterranean style climate. And right behind me is the famous Table Mountain. Beautiful mountain that it almost looks like a mesa. I guess you could geologically call it a mesa. It's got that flat top to it, but it's a mountain, right? And usually during the day it has a tablecloth on it, meaning that the cool air around it from the ocean's got some moisture in it, is pushed up the side of the hill by the breezes, which are always present here on the Cape. And as that air goes up the side of the hill, it condenses, cools, and forms into clouds, which then blanket the top of Table Mountain and then float over like a tablecloth. It's quite beautiful, but it's a clear sunny day with no breeze blowing apparently from the ocean, so it's all clear today. So Table Mountain, and as we pan through the city, you'll see that it's all in a bowl. In fact, this is called the City Bowl down here, as it just floats off of the hills into the flat area, very small flatland actually, out to the coast, to Table Bay, named for the mountain, obviously. And as we pan through Table Bay, you'll see off in the distance an island over there, which used to be a prison, a very famous prison. It's called Robben Island. That's where Nelson Mandela was held for over 2 decades of his life, actually closing in on 3 decades of his life. The other reason I wanted to pan around all the way to both sides of the bay here is you see that there's development on both sides of the hills here, because right splitting the city is Signal Hill. But that's not the only one. If we pan back over this way to across the City Bowl from Table Bay to Table Mountain, on the other side of the hill that we're on here is awesome, beautiful, luxury 5-star hotel beachfront on that side too. So this is an interesting city from its dynamics of it being kind of intense clusters of urbanization on either sides of all the hills around here. Okay, what about Cape Town itself makes it so special in the African experience? South African and African experience. It's got to be South Africa's richest city. In fact, it is. It's got to be one of Africa's richest cities. This place has just got a terrible high degree of wealth. It's got a lot of money. I think it's got 3 to 4 million people in it. It's South Africa's second biggest city by population, certainly its richest city by money. South Africa actually has 3 capitals. All other countries have 1. South Africa has 3, and Cape Town is the capital, I think, where not the parliament, it's not, the president's not here. It's like it's where the business is. I think it's the business section of the government is stationed here in Cape Town. The other thing that to me is fascinating about the Cape Town and why it's different from the rest of South Africa is indeed geologically related. This is a place that's quite separate from the rest of the country, and indeed the whole coastal margin of this part of Africa is separate from the rest of the continent too. Why would that be? Well, it's got something to do with the mountain range behind me. Not even a range, a single mountain that I'm going to use as an example. But if you're looking at this flat expanse, you can just see this whole city. You might think, wow, what a big city, several million people packed in this metropolitan area. And that's true. But it was formed here out of a necessity, not out of desire. Meaning that this colony was started by the Dutch, one of the first kind of big European settlements in Africa. And in 1652, Jan van Riebeck set up a Dutch colony here, pretty much just as a refueling station for ships that were coming from Europe around Africa to get to the rich Indian Ocean trading centers over there to Indonesia and China and India. That's all they really wanted. Nobody really wanted to hang out here. The Dutch didn't even want to hang out here. But being at the point of Africa, it was a perfect midway point to have ships come in and a refuel, a restation, have a little R&R before they set back out to get to the Indian Ocean or back around to Europe. So that's where it started. The Dutch had no idea of making a huge settlement out of it, but as humans are wont to do, once some people started coming here and hanging out and working, they said, hey, well, wonder what's over that hill. I wonder what's over that way. So people started to spread out. A bigger settlement was created, and thus the Cape Town province was started, and it's now turned into South Africa's richest city. But with some caveat here, and the caveat is that it's really kind of separate. Remember back when I was talking on the Hamburg lecture, for those of you who have seen that, I said Hamburg is a city-state that's more of a global city than it is really a city of Germany. Germany probably needs Hamburg more than Hamburg needs Germany, and that is definitely the case here in Cape Town. Cape Town is so super rich, and South Africa as a country is the richest country in Africa, but they're economically struggling right now. Wealth disparity is huge in South Africa. Huge! Meaning the very few people have all the money, and there's millions and millions and millions of people that don't, that are wildly impoverished. And that gets back to the point of how this town works. This is all super rich. You won't find a slum or a ghetto or garbage anywhere in this whole area. And that begs the question, where do the poor people live at? Because the poor people are the ones that work at all the McDonald's and the tourist resorts and clean up all the garbage. They're all day workers. This is actually a remnant of apartheid, the notorious system in South Africa where they segregated the black folks from the colored folks from the white folks. Literally segregated, saying this is a white city. Only white people can live here, but we need labor. So the colored and black folk who are going to be the labor for this, you guys live over there in a township, a created ghetto basically away from the city center, far away from it. And I believe from all of the folks I've talked to today, that's still kind of the case here in Cape Town, even in the 20th century. This place is so super rich, all of the workers come from maybe an hour away, townships an hour away on the other sides of these hills, separate, that have to come in on a bus or a train 50 to 60 minutes each way every day, commuting into a crappy job. How bizarre is that? And this is not the only case of this in South Africa. It's like this in other places, but this is the most extreme manifestation of it in a very big way. And that was apartheid all throughout South Africa that ended in 1994. That saw Nelson Mandela freed in 1990, and who became the first president of South Africa in 1994 after apartheid was abolished. And so we all think, yay, South Africa's all happy and everything's great and everybody sings Kumbaya and gets together and it's all settled now because South Africa's so rich. Not. And that gets me back to Cape Town. The township province stuff is still going on. This is I hate to use the word segregated, but it's an apartheid remnant. It's still in play. Here's where the money is. That's where the poor workers are on the other side of these beautiful landscapes. And again, if you went to the other side of these mountains, I can't even afford to go on the beach there, much less 95% of South Africans could never afford to go hang out on the beach over there, much less own property or even have a job. So it's still kind of a segregated society. And now I'm going to get it back to the geography, to the geology. How has this been facilitated by the natural environment? Beautiful natural environment, by the way. Well, what this is behind me here is Table Mountain. I've already pointed out. It's freaking awesome. In fact, the trams, have you seen the trams running? There's a tram that runs down from that gray building all the way up to the peak, but I haven't seen them running yet. We're going to try to get over there, maybe film that too. But it's just a mountain, honestly. I'm going to use it as a symbol, though. With that flat top, it's kind of like a mesa, right? And what we call this in geology or geography or anything else is when you have an elevated plateau with a really steep face. It's called a scarp. The scarp, a geologic scarp. Scarp's actually Italian for shoe. How that came about, I don't know. But a scarp or escarpment is typified by this exact scene behind me. And an escarpment is a very steep face that separates two different levels of elevation, significant different levels of elevation. So obviously the elevation down here is 0, all right? It's on the water, it's at sea level. And do either of you two know the elevation where we're at right now? I know the cab driver told us. He wanted to say like 1,200 meters? 1,200 meters, so about 3,000 feet? Okay, so somewhere around the 2,500 to 3,000 feet, not terribly high, okay? But again, this is symbolic because this is kind of a mountain range. But here's what I want you to know. Escarpments are prevalent throughout all of southern Africa, the continent. South Africa, the state, is encircled by escarpments, or I should say rimmed by escarpments. But all of southern Africa, the continent, is as well. And what we're seeing here is extremely typical of what's called the Great African Escarpment that runs from Namibia all the way around to Mozambique. And what that means is you have mountains with very little coastline, very little flat land areas in the coast right here, and immediately the land juts up to the next elevation level on these mountains. The Great Escarpment. That's cool. What's that got to do with anything with Cape Town or anything else? Well, because of this, it's actually very hard to permeate into the interior, especially historically. Now in today's world, you can say, oh, we'll take a train or a plane or a bus. Yes, you can take planes and helicopters, but those didn't exist 500 years ago when the Europeans were coming in here and colonizing and taking over Africa. And even before the Europeans showed up, Africa has been a place that naturally is very hard to permeate, to get into, to penetrate the interior. It's one of the reasons why Africa, even up to a couple hundred years ago, was largely unexplored. People didn't really know what was in the inside of it. The Great Escarpment typifies that, because you can't, if you just think about this across a huge wide area of terrain that looks like this. There's the coast, you're coming in by boat, and there's what's behind you. You can't really build a railroad across that. It's very hard. And there are no navigable rivers. If a river is coming from, say, 3,000 to 4,000 feet in the interior plateau and coming out here to just a couple miles before you hit the coastline, it's going to be a waterfall. They're not navigable. So around the entire Great Escarpment, and this is only the biggest, greatest one in Africa. There's other escarpments in the west and eastern sides of Africa, the continent. There are no navigable rivers that go in. And it's hard to build railroads or even regular roads to penetrate into the continent. And thus, the grand picture here with a grand scene behind of me, one of the reasons why Africa is still so undeveloped or less developed in today's world is a matter of history, but also geology. It's a tough place to get across. Even in the 21st century, there is no major transcontinental railroads, no major transcontinental interstate highway system. Trade and movement across Africa is exceptionally hard, particularly compared to almost all other places in the world. Other places exist where it's tough too. Think the Andes Mountains rimming South America. Transportation and communication has always been very hard from, say, Chile to Argentina. They're two separate places too. Or even the Himalayan system, which separates India from the Chinese rest of the continent. So this isn't unique, but it's so prevalent across all of Africa, and even parts of Africa that don't have an escarpment, that have, say, more lower coastal plains that permeate into the continent, say like the Congo. It's in full-on tropical rainforest. Watch out, bird's gonna attack me. It's a full-on tropical rainforest. A deep jungle. The whole Congo River basin is still largely unexplored because it's tropical, tons of diseases, tons of animals that'll kill you, a thick, impenetrable jungle. It's a tough place to get into as well. So you marry a jungle, a rainforest, escarpments, and the Sahara Desert, and the Namib Desert, and the Kalahari Desert. Africa's a tough place to get across still in this 21st century. Let's bring it back home to what I hope is my new home here in Cape Town, South Africa. And that is, these natural geologic formations have kept this part of South Africa kind of separate from the rest of South Africa. And now I'm going to say some things that aren't so savory, which I've already kind of alluded to. The apartheid era segregation of workers and the vested landed gentry class that owns property and runs this town are completely separate. And that doesn't look set to change anytime in the near future. I've been talking to folks locally because I'm worried about South Africa, honestly. It's in the economic doldrums right now. Wealth disparity is greater in South Africa than it is anywhere else in Africa. Now, Africa's poor, and you may look at, there are way other poor areas of Africa, and you come here and you see this magnificent wealth, and you're like, well, this place is doing great, except they also have about 40 million people who live in dire poverty. That number may be high, then again, maybe it's not. I think the population of South Africa is like 45 million people, and only 4 million of them live in this little wonderland right here. It's almost antiseptic. It's almost Disneyland-like down on the coast. It's too clean, it's too beautiful, it's too nice. And you're like, where's Africa at? It looks set to be that way for some time in the future because this area is becoming, and this is gonna sound unsavory, it's becoming wider. So here you are in Africa, the black continent, black Africans, the people who originally were here and controlled all this area. And through European colonization for the last 500 years, and tacked on in South Africa's case to a nasty period that we call the post-colonial era apartheid, full-on legal segregation between the races, and the remnants of it which are still here, after apartheid ended, there was a lot of white flight. A lot of white people said, oh, we're going to get killed if we stay in South Africa, since we were so brutal to the natives for so long, that a lot of people left. A lot of people went exactly that way. A lot of folks from South Africa emigrated to South America, Argentina, Chile, Mexico. A lot migrated to India, to Ukraine, and other parts of Europe. So there was white flight at that point, but what I'm getting the sense of here right now, 2013, is that Cape Town is so rich and so white that they actually have kind of a separate identity from the rest of South Africa as a country. And indeed, it might be that it's becoming whiter as the rest of South Africa becomes tougher. By the way, I keep saying the rest of South Africa is poorer. Unemployment's like 50%. It's 50% in people that are under 30 years old. In the townships and the poor areas, probably easy 40 to 50% across the entire country. Unemployment. Probably not here, probably 100% employment here. So that wealth disparity continues to increase and increase and increase. And as the rest of the country gets tougher and a little rougher, I think what you're going to see is more white folks coming here to their kind of last safe haven. And geology and geography and history play a part of why Cape Town is slightly separately. And I'll end on this. The cab driver that brought us up here, a genius old 75-year-old dude, his genius idea was, yeah, there's too much difference within South Africa. The only way that our country is going to stay together as a whole is if we make it like United Kingdom. And that is separate out the different cultures. Like the United Kingdom is the English in England, the Scottish in Scotland, the Irish in Northern Ireland, and have them in a political union of different cultures in many countries. I dare say that's never going to happen. But it was an intriguing idea that a guy from here came up with that really crystallizes that Cape Town is kind of very separate from the rest of South Africa. And indeed, I think Cape Town is quite separate from the rest of Africa as a whole. Again, if you were dropped here blindfolded, you would not guess you were in Africa. It would probably be the last place you would guess you were at. With so many different folks and so many different languages being spoken and the richness level and everything else. And again, it's all part and parcel for the whole experience from the founding of this colony right on up here to 2013 and what's going on in Cape Town, in South Africa, and Africa as a whole. Party on.